Hi, this is Greg with Two Broke Watch Snobs, and you are in a treat for another edition of the Writers Room. It's a show that we do on YouTube. It's loosely scripted, and today we've got a couple of people from Two Broke Watch Snobs and a special guest with us today. Our topic today is the driver, the ultimate driver. So that would be like a motorsports driving watch. What is the ultimate driving watch? And to explain this whole concept of this diver, driver, flyer series, I'm going to throw it over to my fellow contributor, Baird Brown. Hey, Baird, how you doing today, man?
Good, good. So what the diver, driver, flyer concept is, and Mike actually came up with this from Two Broke Watch Snobs. Mike Penate. I'm sorry if I'm screwing your last name up. Is a 3-watch collection that basically covers all those bases, because that is typically, what most watch categories fall into, either a dive watch, a drive watch, or a flyer. So that is what we talked about the diver a couple weeks ago, and this week we're going to the driver. What we think would be our pick for that particular 3-watch sporting collection.
Sure, got it. Okay, so let's, we're just going to introduce everybody. Hey, Ben, what's going on? Ben is one of our Facebook moderators. Ben, what's happening?
It's going all right. I'm doing pretty good.
Great. Do you want to do a wrist check real quick and
Yeah,
see what you got on?
I'm wearing a Seiko SKX 11.
Okay, cool.
So
Very
just
cool.
one of the orange Japanese variant of the SKX.
Awesome. So does it have like the kanji date wheel and stuff?
This one's Arabic.
Oh, cool.
But yeah.
Very cool. And Baird, what are you rocking today?
I actually, for this occasion, put on my, I've got the Steinhardt race timer on today. It's quite large, but I'm actually going to reference something about my pick that leads into this kind of, but very much a 70s sort of inspired,
No, that's not a homage, correct? Is that one of their designs?
Well, now that's up for debate.
Oh, loaded question.
It is up for debate. The watch is quite large. It is 70. It does have a value 7750 in it, so it's quite thick also. But if you look back at an old Tudor chronograph, and I think they still make one called like the Heritage Chrono. If you look at that watch and compare it to this one, it's upside down. But see, this one has the basic dial is completely blue with the white. If you look at a Tudor, it's white, and these are blue.
Okay, would that be the Monte Carlo?
It might be. I'd have to look it up, but it's literally the colors are swapped and it's rotated.
Okay.
But other than that, it looks very similar. The date, I think, on the Tudor is at 6 o'clock, but the dial is very similar. So as to whether this is an homage or not, there's debate on that.
Okay. Well, that's funny because speaking of homage versus the real McCoy, hey Josh, what's going on? We just had a conversation about this on IG Live last week. So Josh, how you doing? And what's going on? What's on your wrist? And what are you working on?
I'm good, man. Josh Gull here from the Instagram account at Stuffin' Watches. As Greg said, we did a live stream on my account this prior Sunday, and we talked about affordable versus expensive watches and what that looks like. And just working on some photos, working on an Oris review. I am not a Two Broke Watch Snobs contributor personally. Would love to be, but I just don't have enough time to write reviews and keep up with these guys. But I am a longtime fan, listener since the first episode, and just happy to be on here working on photos as I always do in what little free time that I have. On wrist today, I have my Speedmaster First Omega in Space, and I have it on the Forstner Comfit band, which Mike himself has one on his Speedy Pro. And it's a really cool kind of vintage nostalgic vibe to it, especially with the First Omega in Space and the straight lugs and the lack of integrated crown guards. It's a very very interesting look for such a modern chronograph. So,
do you ever get a second look with that band? It's pretty. It's not something you see every day walking down the street. Does anybody ever give you like a, what does that guy have on his wrist?
I think my wife did that as soon as I put it on. She's like, "What is that?" But yeah, it's something that you really don't see very often. It's a very wild look, and I've heard Mike try to describe it on the podcast before, and I can see why it's very difficult to describe, because it's kind of like mesh, but when you think mesh, you think kind of a dressy vibe, and it is in no way dressy. It is very casual, very kind of thin and flimsy feeling. It's a recreation of the old JB Champion bands that the astronauts were, and as I've heard it told, the whole point of those was to be able to break away in the event that it got caught on something. They didn't want the band to be so strong that it put the astronauts' wrist in jeopardy, or their safety. So it's a weird feeling, but it's a really cool look.
Very cool. Now, do you think maybe people call it dressy because it's sort of shiny, like the mesh sort of has like a sheen to it as it moves? Gives you the impression of the dressy nature of it?
I think so. I think that definitely adds something to it. And then I think with this particular thing, and it's going to be very difficult to get across, but the way it's offset with the end links being kind of a big chunky piece of metal, and then I'm not going to be able to show you the clasp from this angle, but the clasp kind of, it brings it back down. It's an oddity in its own way, but it's a nice vibe. It gives it a nice vintage vibe, and I can see why Mike likes his so much after having now had this one for a few weeks. Cool.
Very cool. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you, and thanks for taking the fourth seat today.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.
Okay, so what do you say? Should we get right into it?
Sure.
Okay. We have just a little spoiler alert. We all picked these watches separately. What was the ultimate driver? So these are going to be all your chronographs, racy type watches. They're all sort of different but the same. And I am going to get right into it. I'm going to start it off, and I'm going to have one of the other contributors here end it, just because I want to sandwich everything else in the middle so we can really digest this. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. All right, can you guys all see that?
Yes.
So we got an article. It's very interesting. I don't know if anybody here is into motorsports. I dabble. Don't have a lot of time for it right now, but I'm certainly aware of it. And Jalopnik's one of the bigger blogs out there in motorsports. And what's interesting is they actually grabbed a article from Hodinkee way back in 2015, and this is a really cool one, and this is my pick. I was vaguely aware of this watch until we were going to do the segment, and I really thought about it. And it is the Heuer Autavia, but it's the Autavia Viceroy. So just a little bit about this is Heuer was struggling with sales in the 70s. Cigarette companies were struggling with sales in the 70s, and we don't see it really anymore. We forget about it, but cigarette advertising, in the 50s, 60s, 70s was, that made up a lot of your advertising revenue for a lot of magazines. With some pretty crazy campaigns, and one of them was a partnership between Viceroy cigarettes, which, according to this article, were the #3 brand of cigarette in America, and Heuer's sales were declining, so they partnered with motorsports and Formula One at the time, and this is a little bit crazy. So you could actually send away a flap from a carton of cigarettes and $88 by mail, and you would get a Heuer Autavia chronograph by mail for $88. I don't know what that translates in to today's market, but the regular Heuer sold from anywhere between $185 to $220 in a retail AD at the time. So I don't know if I was in the market for a chronograph, and if I sent in a carton of cigarettes and got like, what is that, rough math, 60% off, I think I'd be in for it. Anybody else would be in for doing that to get a cheap watch?
Oh my God, absolutely.
So here's where it gets really interesting. I'll grab one of the other ads right here, and I really loved it because it was so vintage 70s, so motorsports. The guy, the 70s haircut in the ad, and you can see the little coupon clipping from a magazine in here about the watch that you get and what you have to do to do it. So this $200 chronograph, yours for only $88.
God.
Get a taste of what it's all about. Get the full taste of Viceroy. Keep smoking, kids.
So just to let you know, I looked it up real quick. $86. I just put in 1970. $86 was the equivalent of $573 today.
Oh man.
Man, if you could touch a Heuer for that kind of money, oh my God, that's incredible.
Well, Ben, you're buying a Heuer for $800 or was it $500 in today's money?
In 1970, 86 bucks was $573.
Josh, what about you? You selling your soul and getting a Heuer?
I'm all over that. I'm pretty anti-smoking, but I'll go buy a carton and send it in with a $500 check for that.
And the free set and tote.
Yeah, sounds like a good deal to me. One of the things that struck me of this, I'm going to share this one more time, is one of the things that I always characterize by drivers is for some reason like a leather strap is like, I feel like, I don't know if it's the leather in the car or the difference in materials with the metal, but I always feel like the ultimate driver should have a leather strap on it. And one of the things that I do like on this Heuer is most of them came with the perforated leather strap.
Beautiful.
Which are referred to as speed holes. And what speed holes actually were, or still are, was these guys that would be these weekend warrior racers would do anything they could to lighten their car. And so they would drill holes in everything, seat back, body panels, anything that they could. And that's where the speed holes was born from, and that translated from the seats and other materials into the watch straps, and that's where these speed holes and perforated leather came from on these vintage racing watches.
It's also a really nice touch too to kind of help if you're sweating. It just helps to get some of that moisture out from underneath your leather strap.
Now, Josh, did you do sport compact car racing at one point? Or am I making crazy? Okay.
No,
so
you're not. That has been mentioned before. Yeah, I've done SCCA autocross. I've done drag racing. I've done a lot of different stuff in the motorsports world, and kind of left that behind when I became a parent a few years ago.
Happens.
Yeah, just other financial priorities. Racing cars is very expensive.
It is.
But yeah, you can do it for relatively, inexpensively, and I'm actually going to be referencing some of the experience that I had and kind of correlating that with my pick here shortly. So
awesome. So does anybody else here have any experience on the track?
I have a little, like most people who grew up in Northeast Tennessee or Southwest Virginia. We grew up drag racing Mustangs and Camaros and stuff like that. I've spent in my youth, when I was about 20 years old, I spent a sizable amount of money building a Mustang that I ended up having to pay back over the course of 15 years. But I got into, drag racing is fun. It's awesome, but I got kind of bored of it and got more into road racing, and I've done some autocross, and just street cars, nothing built, nothing with a lot of money in it. Now I basically just run the mountain roads here in East Tennessee. Josh, you may be familiar with the Tail of the Dragon out.
The Dragon 421.
Yeah, I actually, funny enough, you would say that because that's two different things. The Tail of the Dragon is out near Knoxville. 421 is actually what they call the Snake, and it is literally a mile down the road.
Oh, really? I've got some East Tennessee buddies that still live out there near the Tri-Cities and Bristol and things like that, and those are their two roads. They love it out there.
Absolutely, 100%. Oh yeah, I love it so much.
What about you, Ben? You do any racing?
I probably have like the least amount of experience with any kind of cars or racing. Like I didn't even get my driver's license until I was 18. So I'm like, I just drive to get to places, and that's about it. So this is kind of interesting for me to pick a driver's watch because I'm kind of like divorced from that world. But it's really cool just trying to seeing all these complications and things on these watches. Very fascinating.
That's one of the interesting things I think that I really like to romanticize the driver about, is that it sort of really takes you back to that metaphorical yesteryear, because the complication really doesn't apply to anything more than a timer anymore. Everything on the track now is all done, digitally, with, technology that I'm probably not even privy to. And it's more of just really, for me, it's like the vibe and the feeling of it. And that's why I went with something vintage, which is not normally like a pick of mine, but I just felt like that's the Heuer Autavia, particularly the Viceroy edition, would be something that I would feel like you would see on a track maybe in the early 1970s.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant pick. They were so ingrained in motorsports back then. And even, I don't know how recently it goes into modern times. I think Rolex took over a lot of like 24 hours of Daytona type of racing. But Heuer was synonymous with motorsports back in the day.
Yeah. Now here's what's crazy. They couldn't keep up with production on these because, of course, you're getting them for $88 instead of $220. So they subcontracted a lot of this, the production. So they had different case manufacturers, and you can see the reference 1163V was a 13 millimeter case, and the reference 11630, which totally sounds like a Rolex reference number, so that's sort of funny, but is a 14.6 millimeter case. Some of that had to do with the crystal, I thought, but the slimmer case actually had a dome plastic crystal, and the 14.6 apparently had, according to onthedash.com here, had a 14.6 case height with a mineral flat crystal. So who knew? Case backs also come in a couple different variations. And what scares me about this is if you were going to buy one vintage, you really got to do your homework. This is not something I think you can just sort of like, this is not a great first watch to dabble in. What do you guys think?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you this. Does it say what movement's in that? I noticed the crown's on the left side.
I'll have to read through this and get back to you, but it does have that same which I think the Autavia still has today. It still has the crown on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that. I'm going to touch on that actually.
Okay, so let's not dig too deep into that right now. But just my last point on this, which I thought was very interesting, was that I guess there's a different dial that comes with the Viceroy. It's sort of the poor man's version, if you will, because the problem that they got into was imagine if you could send in whatever it is, box tops for cereal and get an Omega at a 60% discount, and then ADs aren't going to be able to sell the same thing at full price. So they put different dials with a little bit nicer markers, a little bit nicer finishing on them, so that they could justify these $220 Autavias versus the $88 Viceroy Autavias. And I think that's a really cool, part of the story. And just that would never fly, in the age of the internet, that's for sure.
So
yeah, that's very interesting.
The cereal box ones are a little bit cheaper as far as the dial is concerned.
Yeah. Do you want to, Josh, are you ready? Would you like to shift gears, bad pun, onto what you'd like to talk about today?
Yeah, we can go right into mine. I think that's good. I will say, as little as I know about vintage Heuers, I'll kind of tag this onto the last thing that you said, but on the dash, I do know that is like the hallmark resource if you're looking for information on them. And there are still deals to be had in that space. So,
yeah.
But my pick is the Omega Speedmaster. I'm wearing, like I said, my first Omega in space. However, I would not consider this reference to be the exact one that I would go for. I'd actually go for the standard Omega Speedmaster Professional. And there's a few reasons for that, because like I said, I've been in situations where I've been behind the wheel of a car in a racing scenario, and you're probably not going to be looking at your watch, but I think Greg kind of hit on something really, really cool when he was talking about his vintage Heuer. Was it just taking you back to a different era? And back in that era, there probably weren't many cars that had, I don't know when clocks became, a staple in cars, but probably back in the 60s and 70s, there's definitely probably not a lap timer in a car. So being able to time your laps back then would be a nice thing. Even now, you're probably not going to have a lap timer in a car. So, but back in the day, or even now, if you're actually behind the wheel and you're racing a car and you were wanting to time splits or anything like that, the Speedmaster has a tachymeter. If you're far smarter than me, you know how to use that. I don't. I've never used it before, probably never will. But take the tachymeter out of the equation and the usefulness of that, if you're so inclined. I think the biggest factor in a chronograph as a driver's watch would be legibility and durability. So I would put those 1A and 1B. So if you can't read the time at a very quick glance, it's almost useless for timing splits. A lot of laps are going to be, if you're road racing or autocrossing or something like that, a lot of your laps are going to be under the 2-minute mark. So you really need a really easily identifiable chronograph hand. And with the Speedmaster Professional, it's just so legible. Of all the watches I've ever owned, and before I got this first Omega in space, I had a Speedmaster Professional. Just look at that photo right there on the screen share. Like, the legibility is unreal, that you can just pick it out at a split-second glance. And in addition to that, as far as durability goes, being so important in a driving format where your focus is controlling the vehicle and you're not worried about accidentally banging your watch against the door of the car or something like that, you got a movement in there that's flight certified by NASA. So if it can handle a blast off to space, it's probably going to be able to handle a few knocks on a car interior.
Yeah, I like what you said about it needing to be legible. I consider personally, I've written it many times, where I consider the Speedmaster Professional to be one of the perfect dials of all time. It's extremely balanced, it's very legible, and it's very easy to read at a glance. And I think sometimes with all the Omega marketing that we forget that the Speedmaster was originally designed and marketed as a racing watch, a racing tool watch, not a moon watch.
And the white hands on that thing that's perfect for legibility, that white against that black.
Yeah, I call it chalk on a blackboard.
Right, and I think a lot of watches lose that when they try to do it. They go with, like, for instance, like a chromed hand or something, which at a certain angle can get lost in reflection. But that white painted hand against that black surface, you can't miss that. Like, it's clearly legible. That's clearly the hand. You know where it's at.
Yeah,
it's perfect for that.
And
It really does jump out so much. And it's interesting that you guys would both, the two of the things you said are just, I mean, you're making my point for me here, in that like the chalk on a blackboard, the hands are so stark white, and the dial, having owned one for years, like the dial is a very, it looks black in that photo, but in person, especially under bright sunlight, and most of your racing is going to be, you know, during daytime hours, in sunshine. Like if it's raining, you may not be racing. So
Absolutely.
the dial almost has like a chalkboard type. It looks pure black in the photo, but in person, it almost has like a very chalky blackboard texture and finish to it. And it really does just kind of, it's not like a black hole of light, but it's legible in any light. And it's actually a watch that I'm really surprised how legible it is in all sorts of light, because right now I have this First Omega in Space, and Baird, like you said, this First Omega in Space, this particular edition has the polished hands, and they do get lost. But the professional model in particular, I mean, there's nothing shiny on the dial at all. It's just black and white, and everything jumps right out at you in an instant. And yeah, I love it for that. And I think it's like you said, Greg, it's just one of the best design dials that ever has been. And I know we can all get a little inundated with Speedmasters at times, but you know, a lot of times things are so prevalent for a reason. And I think the Speedmaster is very worthy of that, going back beyond its Moonwatch roots, you know, back to its origins of racing heritage. Like it's been a great watch right from the get-go, and it remains that today.
Another cool thing about the Omega Speedmaster Professional, you know, they still, I assume, because I don't own one and have never owned one, unfortunately, maybe someday, but they still use a mechanical winding movement. Is that correct? The professional?
And the professional.
Yes, right.
And the First Omega in Space.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you can still get these, and but you can still get these relatively affordably. You know, what are they, $3,000 to $4,000 sometimes on the gray market? I know they may cost more on from an AD, but you know, that in comparison to some of the more also big name chronographs is fairly inexpensive compared, especially something like a Daytona. You know, that Speedmaster is very attainable. Very
absolutely
attainable.
Absolutely. And Daytona's speaking of legibility, legibility is not one of the Daytona's strong suits. You know,
no. You're not wearing that thing to see what time it is.
Yeah, I mean, I know that it a lot of people correlate it with like the, you know, luxury watch associated with motorsports, and a lot of that's due to Rolex's marketing. But you just can't read the time on the things at a glance. So with these watches, I think that mechanical movement and being so rugged as it is, it's really something special that they've done. And you know, there are plenty of Speedmaster homages that aren't direct copies. Like Seiko makes a Mecha Quartz that's really cool. There's quite a lot that you can get from even like $100 up to like $400, $500, $600 in the Mecha Quartz and plain flat out quartz space. But if you look for those same attributes, if you want the vibe of a Speedmaster, they are attainable. The tributes are attainable in some quartz and Mecha Quartz pieces that will still give you that legibility. And you know, you're sitting here looking at the screen share with the Speedmaster that has the bracelet on it, and that's an awesome look. But I think you take the bracelet off, you put it on one of those black perforated straps, like was on that Heuer, Greg, yep. And you have got a motorsports watch that is just a super, super functional tool.
What do you think, Ben? You in on the Speedmaster, in or out?
Well, I'm in. Like I've only been into watches. Like I've like 3 or 4 years now, but you know, it's for me one of the most aesthetically pleasing watches that I've ever seen. Like
yeah,
wonderful aesthetics, and I probably will never own one just because it's not in the price range I'm looking for. But it's one of those pieces that it's classic, and it's classic for a reason.
Sure,
Absolutely.
I'm gonna pull up a modern one, and so there's a modern movement, Speedmaster, not quite a moonwatch, with the new Omega movement in it, and it's probably a good point to talk about how the tachymeter scale, or tachometer, depending how you want to say it, or tachymeter scale works on it. I can do it, or if anybody else wants to chime in.
I know how it works.
Yeah,
I mean,
Baird,
I know how I learned how it works. Okay, so the way that works is that scale is there to time the average speed of a vehicle through a mile, and not like a standing mile like the Texas motor, where they from a stop to a mile. That's different. But for instance, if you have point A and point B, you time a car through that mile, and you can tell the average speed of that vehicle, which is the way I was always taught to do it. So for instance, at the Bristol Motor Speedway, which is 8 miles down the road, that's a half-mile track, so they will do a mile and 2 laps. So once they get going, you can push the button to start, and as they do, once they cross that finish line, once the leader crosses the finish line on that second lap, you would stop it, and that usually they do a lap here at Bristol in about 15 seconds. So 2 laps is usually around 30. So they are averaging on that half-mile track 120 miles an hour, and that's an average. Faster in the straight, slower in the curves, but that's your average through that mile is 120 miles an hour.
I'd like to add that with the tachometer, it's unitless, so you can also do like 1 kilometer, and you can measure it in kilometers as well. It doesn't have to be miles.
Great point. That's a great point. Considering when most of the watches, mechanical ones, they're particularly probably more popular in states that use the metric system. I'm sorry, countries that use the metric system.
Everybody but us.
Yeah, everybody but us. But it does work. I've tried it. On the highway on the way to work, when there's no traffic around, and picking out a mile marker, and have my cruise control set, and it works. It's spot on. So the function before form, I guess.
And as a motorsports spectator, what a cool feature if you were at an event, if you were at, any sort of racetrack, to be able to do that, to see, because you're watching the race and you're like, man, they're flying. But if you can actually use your tachymeter and figure out exactly how fast they're averaging, awesome feature.
And we actually, I usually go to, I haven't gone in a couple of years, but I used to go to the Petit Le Mans in Road Atlanta. And what we would do, or what I would do, my friends don't care about watches, but what I would do is you'd be near the start finish line, pick your car, hit the timer as he would come by, and see if he is better in the next couple of laps, or if he's slowing down. Because if he's slowing down, that sucks. If he's doing better or staying about average, that's better. That's what I would do, because obviously they have electronic timers for that now, and you don't need it. But that was fun for me, was to see if they were improving or if they were falling back.
Sure. So you can almost, like, you're a spectator, but you're also passively participating in something that you can actually touch and measure yourself. Pretty cool.
Absolutely.
All right. I think it's Ben's turn, and I'm going to pass the metaphorical mic over to him and get his screen share ready for his pick, which is super cool. Didn't see it coming, and I want to know more.
So I was actually introduced to this piece by my father. My father had been eyeing this piece. It's a Seiko SSC 637. It's
not your normal reference number that you see posted all over the place. I'm going to share it real quick. Keep going.
It's the Jimmy Johnson chronograph. And so for those who don't know Jimmy Johnson is a NASCAR driver. He's considered one of the greatest NASCAR drivers, won 7 NASCAR Cup championships, And and so back in around August 2016, this watch came out. Seiko released a couple versions of this watch, and so this is a particular watch I think is the most aesthetically pleasing one, with the blue bezel and the blue highlights on the subdials.
Right. Now, I'm not well versed in NASCAR, but do you think that had anything to do with his sponsors at the time of sort of matching the car? Because now that I'm looking at it,
I actually do not know that. Maybe someone else, Baird, would you know?
I don't know if they did that on purpose, but it does, that blue color does, Lowe's was like a blue and black kind of color scheme. So that does look like that. I could see that being sort of a Jimmy Johnson Lowe's sort of thing.
Yeah, maybe I'm stretching it. Imagine that, a blue and black watch, but go ahead, Ben.
And there's some really interesting things about this watch. First of all, it's solar chronograph. It uses the Seiko V176 movement in there. So at your 12 o'clock, you have the 1/20th second stopwatch. And then you have the running seconds at your 9 o'clock. And then you have your 60-minute at your 6 o'clock. And in addition to that, it also has a 60-minute bezel, which is something that you don't see really on a chronograph. And then you have on the interior of the bezel, you have the tachymeter. So it's some really unusual features for what I've seen in chronographs. Like, you don't really see unidirectional bezels, and you don't really see a lot of solar chronographs either. So another interesting thing is also has 100 meters water resistance as well. So that's pretty cool. And then on the back as well, since it doesn't have anything Jimmy Johnson on the front, but on the case back, it has the Jimmy Johnson signature and lasered in, and a special edition, it says on the case back.
I don't know if you guys can see that watching YouTube at home, but you can sort of see a scribbly signature on there. It looks like 2 J's.
The cool thing about that one is that it looks like it does want to be not just a chronograph and not just one that's associated with cars, but it also wants to be like your everyday watch. It's like, hey, we've got some other features too, which a lot of the, like standard mechanical chronographs don't. Ben, do you know if that, I guess it's a one, I'm trying to see it. Is it a 1/20th of a second counter?
Yeah, so 1/20th of a second counter.
Very good.
So that thing's gonna be flying once you engage it.
So I just thought it was something that you don't really see very often. Like, I don't see this watch talked about at all. Like, I've never seen it really talked about. And it's just, my dad bought it, and so I got to handle it in the flesh, and it's a pretty cool watch, and it actually wears pretty well.
Josh, have you ever seen one of these?
No, I haven't seen one of these specifically. I'm just looking at it here, and like specs wise, it looks to be very thin for a chronograph, and a 20 millimeter bracelet width, it looks like, is on there. Yeah, and obviously we know the magic that Seiko can pull off in their case geometry to make it sit really well on the wrist. I've got a feeling that this would be a really cool watch on wrist. I actually really like the crown detail going on in there, and I love the functionality of the 60-minute bezel. Like, this thing is a functional dream.
I do like how they included a second strap in there. If you buy the full kit there, and it's got this sort of faux carbon fiber weave, so it's definitely got that racing vibe still, but more maybe a modern feel, like modern racing.
Yeah, I'd say it's very modern.
Has a kind of, as Baird was saying, it has a kind of more of an everyday, more versatile look, modern look than your average chronograph.
Right. And, unlike a vintage Heuer, you could probably actually wash your hands while wearing it and not freak out.
It's actually kind of interesting.
Either. I mean, my dad picked it up for $200. So, I mean, it's a very affordable watch.
Yeah, definitely more accessible, I think, than anything that we've brought up so far. Well done.
And Jimmy Johnson is anybody that doesn't know, and I'm not a big NASCAR guy, but Jimmy Johnson is a NASCAR guy. But the vibes I get from this watch are very Formula One.
I would agree with that. Maybe just looks a little just more technology forward.
Yeah, it's a really cool look.
Okay, I think we're going to move along to Baird to bring us home here with the last pick. Let's see, Baird, do you want to introduce us to what you got going on here?
All right. So when you came up with this, immediately my mind went to vintage Heuers. I actually don't like tag Heuer as much. I think.
Are we talking tag Heuer or just Heuer?
The one I'm talking about is a new one, but it's an old one as well. It's sort of not changed that much in the last 40 years, 50 years. I'm getting older than I thought, but I actually don't like tags that much. But when you look at, like you were saying, I think with yours, when you think of motorsports in the 60s and 70s, there's absolutely no way that you don't think of Jack Heuer. He was involved very much in that. A lot of his designs went towards that, and the one I picked was more aesthetic than actual function, because it didn't actually get used that much in motorsport. It did appear on Steve McQueen's wrist in the movie, in the Le Mans movie. I'm talking about the Heuer Monaco. The cool thing about this particular watch, and I chose the Gulf livery for anybody who's into any kind of road racing, endurance racing, you know what Gulf is. Even if Gulf doesn't mean jack squat today, it did back then. And to see those colors on a car now is too cool. Everybody loves a Gulf car. But this watch was created, I think it came out in the early 70s. The movement is a caliber 11, which is why I asked you about the crown on the left side, because the caliber 11s all had the crown on the left side. The caliber 11 was a collaboration between Hamilton, Heuer, Breitling, and they came up with this. And what the special thing about this is all chronographs were mechanical up until this point. They were in a race to invent the automatic chronograph, which Zenith, I think, may claim that they did it first, but technically on paper it was this collaboration here. So sure enough, this was the caliber 11 was the first automatic chronograph. Now originally the rotor that spins was inside. It was actually a micro rotor underneath the chronograph plate, which the new one has a big rotor on the back like a normal one.
So you're talking like a micro rotor,
like
a pull router or something like that?
Yeah, it's a rotor. A micro rotor is if you ever see a micro rotor watch, it has a rotor, but it's just smaller, so it fits in a more compact space. And I noticed on the new ones, it's on the back of the watch, as you can see, just like any other automatic. But once upon a time, when you looked at a caliber 11, it looked like like a mechanical chronograph, and the rotor was actually underneath the chronograph plate.
Okay.
It was a micro rotor under the chronograph plate, so you couldn't actually see it, but it did wind itself. So that was a big deal, the automatic winding chronograph. And like I said, this watch didn't actually end up getting that much play in motorsports, but it was on Steve McQueen's wrist. That's what made it famous. But to me, like we've been talking about, how these watches don't really have a huge amount of use in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to pick one aesthetically, I love a square watch. To me, that screams kind of 1970s. The Gulf colors. It is only 39 millimeters, so we're not talking a honker. I think that watch is really, really cool looking and looks cool with any car, especially a vintage car. And that's why I picked it. Again, kind of like my Tudor pick. Yeah, there he is. Look at that.
The king of cool.
Absolutely. Look at that. I mean, that is motorsport. Look at the watch with the fire suit and everything. It's too cool. And like I said, real drivers probably didn't wear it, but it looks cool. That's what you think of when you think of 1970s motorsport.
So Heuer's involvement with motorsport is what I've heard is that they were practically giving away watches to Formula One drivers at the time, and they were in turn, because they didn't make big money like they do now, in turn selling them to other people around the track, and that's where they sort of solidified their sort of cult status as a track watch.
And it very much could have been. And the funny thing is the people who do that now are companies like Hublot and Richard Mille. In my opinion, those watches are pretty much worthless for motorsport, but they are today's. They have the synonymous names with the F1 racing and the endurance racing crowd. But to me, if I were to have enough money to buy, say, a Porsche GT3 RS, that thing would look pretty cool with this sweet driving hat and a pair of leather gloves. I do like that feature on the website too, that you can actually play with the chronograph.
Yeah, I was messing with that a little bit. I just sort of
they also make this watch in a caliber 12, which is a standard right side crown model, so you don't have to get the caliber 11. I like the caliber 11 because that's I think that's what makes that particular watch and some of the other Heuer watches at the time unique. Some of the Hamiltons also have it. I think that's kind of cool about it. But what I was going to say about that movement is that movement paved the way for things like the Valjoux 7750 today. That movement paved the way for automatic winding chronograph movements, which unfortunately are a little bit thicker than your Omega with the manual winding one. They can keep those pretty thin, which is a very nice feature. But the automatics are definitely going to be thicker. But that watch paved the way for a Valjoux 7750 that is in everything.
So do you think the lack of a circular bezel with the tachymeter scale on it, does that in any way impact you, or does just Steve in the fire suit just blow it out of the water and it doesn't matter?
It does actually a little bit. When I buy a chronograph particularly, even though I don't use it for that reason, I like a tachymeter scale or tachometer, however you say it. And this watch, again, this is a looks thing. It's not so much this is more form over function. And unfortunately, it doesn't have that. But, some of the other Heuers of that era, the Carreras, the Autavias, they do have that. But I do personally look for a tachometer scale. I had a micro brand Mecha Quartz watch. It was who was that brand? The watch was called a Silverstone. And I can't remember the brand, but the killer for me was it didn't have Hellgray. That's it. I had a blue one. That's right. And it's it's not a bad little watch for $200. I think I bought it used for $200 or $200 less, and it's not a bad little watch. Again, they beefed it up with the photos on their website with the vintage car inspired stuff, which I love and I'm a sucker for. You put a spark plug and a pinup girl or something on it, that's it. But, unfortunately, the lack of the tachometer bezel actually did bother me. So I actually got rid of that watch and got a Dan Henry 1964, which does have the tachometer bezel and the same movement. And we were talking about, I know I'm rambling, but we were talking about the white hands on the Omega being very legible. The Dan Henry 64, in my opinion, is supposed to look like a 2447. I have the Evil Panda, the black dial with white, or the 3 white subdials, sorry. And that second hand is like a blued color. In my opinion, on the Evil Panda, it needs to be white because it is absolutely illegible.
Got that, Dan?
On the Evil Panda, that second hand needs to be white. It can be whatever color you want on the other ones. Got to be white on the black face.
Josh, what do you think about the Monaco? I don't think this is something I'd see you, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, personally wearing your collection. What would you think of, what would this watch be like to photograph, to edit? Is this thing going to be a bear to try to get a shot with, or what?
No, I think it'd be a blast to photograph. if you've ever seen one in person, we have a couple of Jared Gallery of Jewelry here, the stores, and they're a Tag Heuer AD. And so I have gone in there and tried a Monaco on several times on wrist, and
It's big.
it's big, it's beefy, but somehow not. It's so strange to try to describe. Like it's chunky without being overly large. It's not like XL size. It's large, but it works for what it is. There's some really cool stuff. At a glance, you're not going to notice it, but if you look at the beveling around the crystal's edge, and there's like some compound curves to the crystal that really provide a lot of detail that you can get lost in. I couldn't personally see myself wearing this on any type of regular daily occasion, but I think my pick for the Speedmaster came from a place of just pure functionality, which is kind of how I tend to look at my watches. But that said, you take that picture of Steve McQueen in his racing suit and you put a Speedmaster on his wrist, it just doesn't look as cool. It doesn't look as cool as any of the other three choices. Those choices look so.
James Bond putting on a Submariner. It sort of throws everything else out the window.
And the thing I love about that is something I feel like they did a lot of back then was the colors, I guess. A lot of watches today are black, but they had such cool colors on watches back then, and they tried different things. But I like those colors of the 1970s. Is it a functional watch? Probably not, but it is cool looking. And I think, and one thing I think is cool about it too is it's $6,500. That's a lot of money. Kaz would say a lot of doll hairs, but it's still cheaper than a Rolex Daytona by a gargantuan amount. So.
Sure.
And you can get those used for the same price as you can get a Speedmaster used for. And
That's crazy.
If you really want vintage racing vibes and you want to buy a brand new chronograph, you'd be hard pressed to do better than that. Even gray market brand new, I think they're only like right at 4 or maybe a touch over, which is no insignificant amount of money, but it is a piece of history without a question.
One of the other things to mention is the difference that people should be aware of with a square case dimension versus a round case dimension is that the surface area of something that's 39 by, say, 39 is going to be greater than the dimension of a circular object that is 39 millimeters across. You got more, it's just simple math, you got more real estate there. So it's going to wear much larger than a 39 millimeter watch.
And the great thing is that it's still, even the modern one is still just 39. They didn't beef it up to 42, 44, or some other gargantuan size, so yeah, you're right. A square watch does wear bigger. But I think that they kept it small is really cool.
I'd actually say it wears very similar to something like a Seiko Sumo or something, which is around that 44, but with some magic in the case to where it still works on smaller wrists just fine. Like I've had a Monaco on my wrist, and I really prefer watches that are under 40 millimeters personally, which was a big decision on my personal part to switch from the regular Speedmaster Professional down to the first Omega in Space, just a little bit more of a compact size, and I really like something in like a 36 to 38 millimeter range, but something about that Monaco just works, man. It just works.
Sure. Okay, so we're gonna start to wrap it up here. I'm gonna throw everybody a little curveball question, unrehearsed. So you've got your ultimate chronograph, all right? Then you've got your car of choice, the last tank of fuel on the planet, where you taking it, and who's going with you in the car, what car it is. So last tank of gas, you pick the car, you pick the route, and you pick who's in shotgun with you. So Ben, I'll start with you.
Oh, my dream car has always been a 1909 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost.
Oh my gosh, very good.
So I would pick that.
Car.
And I'd probably pick my best friend, Christina. I mean, we'd just go and probably pick a ride in Spain.
All right, Christina, look for the big silver beast to pick you up and go for a ride. Baird, what about you?
If I could have, funny enough, if I could have any car, it would probably be a TVR Sagaris, which is a British car with a screaming 400 horsepower, 4-liter straight six. Probably unsafe at any speeds and breaks down constantly, but I would have that car. As far as cool places to go, I've never been out of this country, so I don't know where I'd go. There's so many places I'd love to go. The Highlands of Scotland, somewhere in Japan. Who knows? Who knows? But that TVR, man, that thing would scream wherever it went. I can tell you that right now.
All right, Josh, what about you? You got the Speedmaster, last tank of fuel. You got whatever car you want, and who's going with you, and where you're taking it.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get two answers from me here, a head and a heart answer. So my head says, you know, I was the kid growing up that, you know, it was always like Lamborghini, Ferrari, or Porsche. And I was always the kid that had the Porsche 911 Turbo on the wall. So give me any Porsche 911 Turbo. I don't care if it's air-cooled, water-cooled. I don't care. Probably the newer, the faster, the better. Give me that. Give me my best buddy. His name's Kermit. That's his real name. And you know, let us rip around the Black Forest and the Autobahn in Germany. That's my head answer. My heart answer is going to be so polar opposite of that, in that same said best friend Kermit, him and I bought a Miata together that we spec'd out with you know, class specific upgrades and race tires for SCCA Solo 2 autocross back in the day. And so while my head says Porsche 911 Turbo, my heart says first generation in a Miata on race rubber around an autocross course that I get to design, because I have literally in my life never had more fun in any vehicle than I have in a Miata, flat out on the accelerator, ripping around turns, lifting the inner rear wheel. It just doesn't get any better than that. And you're having a blast for like less, you know, the same price of the whole car and race setup, you know, would cost about the same as the Speedmaster did.
And let me tell you, great pick. I had a buddy with an SCCA spec Miata, fat, slick tires, basically, you know, have cool suspension on it. It's lowered suspension, tighter suspension, bigger brakes. But basically, the engine didn't have a whole lot done. He did have a Jackson Racing supercharger, but it only put out 3 PSI, so not a ton. And man, that car was absolutely incredible. Oh my God, it was incredible. You couldn't. There was. You would give up before that car ever started screeching tires. It was absolutely incredible, unbelievable.
It's like they're glued to the road.
Glued to the road.
And until you've actually been behind the wheel of one and driven one flat out, it's an experience. Like, I mean, I've been in race spec Z06 Corvettes. You know, I've crazy high horsepower rigs. And I have never had more fun in a car with my clothes on than I have in a Miata race.
Well, the big horsepower cars, and I don't mean to run long, but the big horsepower cars, you have to have 1.5 miles straight stretch and going into a curve to have any fun with that. A Miata you could take out on 421 and do 30, 40 miles an hour around curves and have the blast of your life.
So I'm gonna do a wrist check. I guess I forgot to do one. Real quick, I just realized that I'm wearing the Nezumi Voiture.
Oh,
Mecha Quartz, Pink Panther. Got it on the black racing leather. Great Mecha Quartz watch, and I love the whole Mecha Quartz movement. Josh and I talked about them during one of our live casts. Just puts these vintage-inspired chronographs at an accessible price point that I think is so cool. The car would be the Shelby Eleanor, and it would be going up the California coast with my dad. He used to live in California, and his grandparents lived in Fresno, and he lived in the LA area. and he had a Mustang in the mid 70s, and he used to tell me about, you know, how fast he could make that trip. So yeah, just a little bit of a nostalgic vibe there. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Josh, thank you very much for being our guest today. Baird, will be looking forward to some of those reviews that you've got up cooking for twobrokewatchknobs.com. And Ben, thank you very much for holding the Facebook page down. We appreciate it and managing the group there. And so thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Glad to be here.